Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Martina Droth. I'm the Deputy Director of Research and Curator of Sculpture here at the Centre, and I'm really pleased to introduce tonight's lecture. And I know that very many of you, most of you, maybe all of you in this room are as delighted as I am to welcome back to Yale Catherine Roach. I'm going to call her Kate. Kate is now Assistant Professor of Art History at Virginia Commonwealth University, but of course she did her undergraduate studies here at Yale. Then she went on to her PhD at Columbia, and while she was at Columbia, she came back to Yale as a visiting scholar here at the Centre. And to her attention came that painting by John Scarlett Davies, dated 1829, showing the interior of the British institution, hung with paintings for an exhibition. And that research that she undertook at that time developed into an exhibition, a focused dossier exhibition, which was among the first shows that I saw here at the Centre. I had just joined when we opened that show in 2010, and it was called Seeing Double, Portraits, Copies and Exhibitions in 1820s London. And I know that many of you will remember that show, which focused on this painting by Davies and brilliantly decoded and deconstructed the pictures within the picture. And that exhibition in many ways sums up the sort of central focus and thrust of Kate's ongoing research interests that she has continued to pursue, and which revolve around this fascinating trope of the appearance of pictures within pictures, and sometimes sculptures within pictures. And I hope Kate might mention her discovery about the sculpture in our painting in her talk. And so we're all familiar with this self-reflexive trope of depicting pictures within pictures, but it can be quite hard to know what to do with that, how to interpret that, and how to understand the significance. And I don't think anyone has tackled that phenomenon in a broadly collective way as a kind of subgenre within painting. And I think one reason for that is that very often it seems so very specific. We're looking at individual paintings and individual artists being recreated on the canvas. So how can one extrapolate these ideas across a variety of paintings and across time? Well, I think that this is exactly what Kate does and has done so brilliantly in her work. She has looked at individual works of art that depict pictures, and she's also looked at them as a group and has developed really interesting and important methodologies for us to think about why these paintings have their own significance as a kind of a genre within painting history. And I think there are very illuminating facets about historiography and reception and exhibition history to be identified in that trope. I just want to mention one project of Kate's that I'm particularly familiar with. Over the course of the past year, or maybe a little more, it's been my pleasure and also my colleagues at the Paul Mellon Centre, the team of people that works together on producing our relatively new journal, British Art Studies. We've worked with Kate on developing an article, or maybe I should call it a project, because it's much more extensive than an article, about exhibitions of works by Joshua Reynolds that were held at the British Institution in the 19th century. And this entailed a very carefully thought out reconstruction of the building and how the historic shows of Reynolds' works might have been hung at the time. We published that piece back in November, and it was a really wonderful and gratifying thing to be able to do for our new journal, because we really want to create new models for both how we do art history and how we present it. And I think Kate's project really does all of those things. It's an exceptional piece of research and writing in its own right, and it's also a really amazing model for thinking about how we can use technology in our art historical research, how we can harness new tools that are increasingly available to us to think differently about our work and present it in new ways. So it's been a real joy to work with Kate, to keep in touch with her and follow her work, and I'm so pleased that she's here tonight. I'm excited about her new book, her first monograph, which is titled Pictures Within Pictures, appropriately enough, in 19th century Britain. It was published by Routledge a few months ago in 2016, And we'll now have a chance to hear Kate talk about the work that stands behind that book. And afterwards, I hope you'll all join us to raise a toast to Kate and her publication. But now, please welcome Kate Roach to the podium.
Hello. Thank you to all of you for being here tonight. I can think of no better place to celebrate the publication of my book than the Yale Center for British Art, which has been so supportive of the project from the very beginning. As Martina mentioned, I came here as a visiting scholar when I was a graduate student working on the dissertation that would become this book. I was shocked and slightly startled to learn that that was a decade ago. 10 years. That is sometimes how long it takes to write a book. And so I'm really thrilled to be celebrating with you all tonight. And I wanted to say a thank you to Amy Myers, to Martina, to Matthew Hargraves, and also to two people who aren't here tonight, Eleanor Hughes and Cassandra Albinson, and also to Tim Berenger, who's been a champion of the project from the beginning. And I also wanted to say two special thank yous, and the first is to Jillian Forrester, who was my internship supervisor so long ago I won't even mention, but Jillian knows. It was a while ago. And that was a really formative experience here in the print room, learning about objects and about their life histories before they had come to the center, and a really important experience for me. And I just want to say congratulations, Jillian, and we're going to miss you. And my second thank you is to someone who's not here tonight. Wait, let me check. Yes, someone who's not here tonight, which is my dissertation advisor, Anne Iguenae. And I wanted to mention her, and as you'll notice, I'm about to, in my talk, take issue with something she's written recently. And I thought it was only fair to also say at this point that writing a dissertation on a British art topic at Columbia University would not have been possible without her support. So many thanks, and thanks to you for being here. Let's begin. So, the title of this recently published essay collection appears to ask a question. Is Paris still the capital of the 19th century? I say appears because I think it is fair to say that the editors of this volume already knew their answer when they started their project. The answer is yes, absolutely. Not all the contributors to the volume agreed, and the collection includes really compelling dissents by post-colonial scholars in particular. But many participants did affirm the notion that Paris holds a special status. For example, Anne Iguenae offers a brilliant new reading of an iconic work, Edouard Manet's portrait of his friend and advocate, Émile Zola. Above Zola hang images of Spanish and Japanese art, along with a photograph of Manet's own painting, Olympia. Iguenae argues that these images signal not only Manet's sources of inspiration, but also the painter's intense awareness of the reproductive media that made such inspiration possible. And in keeping with the spirit of this volume, Iguenae also claims Manet's insights as an example of French exceptionalism. Quote, "Arguably, Paris made it all possible. Parisian patterns of intellectual sociability fostered emulation and competition, comparison and reference," end quote. But this type of image was not limited to France. By way of comparison, consider a painting conceived not in Paris but in Oxford, John Everett Millet's portrait of a middle-class mother, Eliza Wyatt, and her daughter, Mary. In Millet's portrait, the prints behind the central figure are not a source of inspiration. Rather, these engravings after Leonardo and Raphael represent a model that has been rejected, as is appropriate to a member of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. But like Manet, Millet revels in the complexity of this act of depiction, a painting of a print that reproduces a painting. He indicates the precise reproductive means by which these Renaissance motifs entered the British home, while at the same time pointedly rejecting them as visual models. Contrasting, for example, the deliberately stilted pose of Eliza and her daughter to the sinuous lines of the Madonna della Sedia, And in a wonderful visual joke, which you'll see here, in Millet's version, the Madonna seems to know that she's being rejected. And specifically, the bashful glance of Raphael has become, in Millet's hands, this kind of petulant scowl. And it turns out that this kind of joke was by no means exclusive to Millet or to Britain. And as I am not the first to point out, if we go back to the Manet portrait, in this rendering of the photograph of Olympia, the protagonist abandons that famous confrontational stare and instead looks downward approvingly at the man who had defended her in the press. So, although working in different national contexts, these artists shared a sense of humor, as well as a fascination with the complex interrelationships of painting and printmaking. And this comparison is one of a myriad that can now be posed, now that the study of 19th century art has expanded, thanks in part to the postmodern interest in approaches other than the avant-garde and in media other than painting. And yet today we are still asked why we study British art when French art exists. Why we examine the art of a cold, dim island on the edge of the Atlantic when Paris is self-evidently the glowing, electrified capital of the 19th century, at least in the minds of editors who know the answers before they pose the question. And this debate is not at all a new one. In the course of writing my book, I found that British artists of the 19th century were deeply aware of the perception that the most interesting art was produced somewhere other than Britain. To respond to that challenge, they turned to a profoundly self-aware device, the picture within a picture. By recreating pre-existing works on their own canvases, they incorporated previous images into their own, and in the process, they also transformed them. They used these repainted paintings to negotiate their vexed relation to the history of art as it was then understood, and to make statements about their own work and why it was important. Whether these statements were understood by their original audiences was deeply dependent on display context. These small but significant passages of paint might be easily overlooked in a crowded group exhibition, but quickly recognized in a more intimate space. In fact, as I discovered in the course of my research, most of the works considered in my book were displayed for a time within the very space they represent, sometimes among the very paintings they recreate. Each chapter of the book therefore considers a different artist and this display context in which his or her works were shown. Those display contexts would have encouraged recognition and provoked comparison, such as the case with, got ahead of myself there, with Millet's portraits of the Wyatt family. And you see here this work that is a pendant to the portrait of Eliza was actually hung in the family home on the High Street in Oxford in the same back parlor that it depicts. Along the same lines, J.M.W. Turner's watercolors of the country house of Petworth, seat of his patron the Earl of Egremont, may have been shared in the same sort of convivial situation that is seen here, in the presence of the very works they so spectacularly re-envision. In contrast, the genre painter Emma Brownlow King created works destined for a public venue, the Foundling Hospital, where they were shown alongside works by William Hogarth. Here, Brownlow King simultaneously recreates and obliterates Hogarth's March to Finchley, subsuming his narrative detail with her own boldly flickering brushwork. Finally, and perhaps most spectacularly, there is William Powell Frith's valedictory meditation on the Royal Academy as a venue for the National School of Art, depicting a private view held in 1881, this was actually shown at the Academy 2 years later. Each of these examples poses different answers to the same questions. What is the relationship of British art to the art of the continent? Should artists look abroad or to homegrown heroes? If homegrown, then to Hogarth or to Reynolds. At the same time, however, that they engage these questions about the national school and national identity, each of these pictures also tells a deeply personal story about the artist who created it and the context for which they were creating. And that brings me to this topic of tonight's talk, in which we absolutely find the combination of the national and the personal. This wonderful painting by John Scarlett Davis, Interior of the British Institution, and this is the subject of the first chapter of my book. As Martina mentioned, in 2010, I had the great privilege of curating an exhibition here at the center called Seeing Double, which focused on this remarkable painting. It depicts an exhibition staged in London in 1829 at the British Institution, a philanthropic organization run by affluent collectors. Founded in 1805 at the height of the Napoleonic Wars, the institution was intended to promote national excellence in the arts. Today, it is perhaps best known for the efforts of its leaders to convince British artists to study the continental old masters. And less appreciated is their role in promoting a canon of 18th century British painters, chief among them Reynolds. John Scarlett Davis's painting celebrates these goals. It shows artists at left and art lovers at right, united in the effort to promote the national school. It offers a complex visual argument for the idea that the British school could and should evolve in conversation with continental precedents. Prominently included among the old masters to either side of the archway are works by two representatives of the British school, Reynolds and Gainsborough. And at left, two painters, Benjamin West and James Northcote, examine a self-portrait by Reynolds. All of these likenesses, whether framed or unframed, were closely based on existing portraits, as our exhibition of 2010 explored. Together, they tell a story about the British school and its promotion by the British institution. But until recently, part of that story, a very personal part, was missing. When the exhibition opened, a mystery remained. Who was depicted in the portrait bust? Clearly, this object is important to the picture's complex program, presiding as it does above the group of artists. But we simply did not know who it represented. This sculpture had previously been identified as Sir Francis Chantrey's bust of an important patron of the institution, the Marquis of Stafford. But visual comparison led me to discount that attribution. The Stafford bust is crowned with thick, curly hair, unlike the receding, close-cropped hair of the statue in the Davis. And Stafford's head is tilted at a distinct downward angle towards the viewer's right, while the sculpture in the painting looks out and to the left. Vexingly, however, having deposed the Marquis, I had no better person to suggest in his place, until now. While conducting research for the book, I was able to identify the subject, and I did so by combining traditional art historical skills and tools that come from newly available digital resources. So in search of this portrait bust, I looked through every plate of the meticulously researched catalog published by the National Portrait Gallery in London. And while I was doing that, I noticed that the drapery in a bust by Edward Hodges Bailey was similar to the drapery in the sculpture and the painting. And so I did what any scholar in this day and age would do. I started Googling Edward Hodges Bailey. And there, on the Sotheby's website, was this. This is a portrait by Edward Hodges Bailey of a man named Richard Hart Davis, dated 1823. And you can imagine how excited I was when this popped up on the computer screen, seeing that the folds of the drapery, the aquiline features, the receding hairline, the angle of the head, it all matched. And so in this case, a long-standing practice of connoisseurship, which is that examination of minute details, provided me with the name of the sculptor, and then the internet got me the rest of the way there. And so now that this identification has been made, the real fun begins, right? Who was this man? Why does he show up in Davis's picture? And it's important to note here that as far as I can tell, the painter, John Scarlett Davis, and the man in the sculpture, Richard Hart Davis, were not related despite the fact that they did share a last name. Born in 1766 to a Bristol trading family, Hart Davis made a vast fortune in banking and trade. He was one of the many who profited from an economic system based on the forced labor of the enslaved in the West Indies. He used this ill-gotten fortune to fund a political career. A staunch conservative, not shocking those two things going together, and a friend of Lord Liverpool, he served as a member of Parliament for over 2 decades. The party found him a useful man, in part because of his great wealth. Liverpool estimated that the merchant had spent over £40,000 on elections. At the same time, he was also spending much more than that on art. In 1813, the artist Joseph Farrington reported that Hart Davis, quote, had not 20 or 25 years ago 1,000 pounds in the world, and is now supposed to be worth from 300 to 500,000 pounds. He is an exception to the general character of Bristol merchants, as he lives at large expense. His collection of pictures is supposed to have cost him 100,000 pounds. And just to give you a sense of what that means in the currency of the time, 100,000 pounds worth of art, a John Scarlett Davis painting, including probably the one we're talking about tonight, he was very happy to get 100 pounds for that work. And Gustav Wagen later included Hart Davis on a list of the most distinguished collectors in England since 1792, a reputation that Hart Davis cultivated through a series of high-profile purchases. He seems to have enjoyed making grand gestures. In 1808, he purchased two well-known paintings, the Altieri Claudes, for a record-setting price, and he soon turned his attention to contemporary art. According to Farrington, he offered Benjamin West 1,000 guineas for his painting of Christ showing a little child as the emblem of heaven. Quote, West was struck with his generosity and accepted his offer, expressing that it was a sum above any price he should have mentioned. Mr. Davis said that having now nearly completed his collection of pictures by old masters, he should make a collection of pictures by the best modern artists, end quote. And then Hart Davis asked West to suggest other paintings he might buy, and when West mentioned a painting by Thomas Stothard, Hart Davis empowered him to purchase it for him at above asking price. Keep in mind here, he had not seen this painting yet. So he did not know whether he liked it, but he did know that he wanted to be known to have bought it and have bought it at more than what the artist was asking for. Hart Davis also demonstrated his role as a patron by becoming an hereditary governor of the British institution. And you'll see his name is on the bottom here towards the right, very proudly with those, putting as many letters as possible next to the name, so both Esquire and MP are proudly inscribed there. And like many museums today, the membership had the institution had a tiered membership structure. So basically, the more you donated, the better the perks. This is a very familiar system, right? And the hereditary governorships were the most expensive. And as the name suggests, they were actually something that you could will to an heir and have passed down through your family, your connection, and your privileges at the institution. And it's been argued that this membership structure was meant to appeal to the large number of peers who participated in the organization. And as you can see, heading up this list here is a very impressive number of titles. But it's my feeling that those guys already had titles, right? And so in terms of an effective recruitment tactic, I think for the people for whom the hereditary governorships were in many ways the most appealing were commoners like Hart Davis who didn't have titles to pass on to their heirs, but were able to purchase this kind of alternative form of status through the institution. And the British institution is often described as an aristocratic organization, and of course the patronage and support of peers was an important part of the story, but I believe that it flourished because it was a site of cross-class collaboration, that one that benefited all of those involved in different ways, so that a wealthy peer could seek to justify the privileges of rank and fortune by participating, and a nouveau riche such as Hart Davis could seek social advancement through the conspicuous patronage of this national endeavor. So I hope we can begin to see then why Hart Davis belongs in this picture. He was a member of the institution and a newly prominent patron of contemporary artists, including Benjamin West, who stands below his sculpted likeness. But here the plot thickens. By 1829, when this painting was created, Hart Davis was a collector without a collection. The end of the war with France in 1815 brought on a general economic slump. By 1816, Hart Davis was in financial distress and was forced to transfer many prize works from his collection, including his clothes, to a business associate, Philip Miles, as payment in lieu of debt. The final blow came in 1819, when a failed speculation in government funds led Hart Davis to declare bankruptcy. But despite these reversals, Hart Davis did not retire from public life. He retained his seat in Parliament, perhaps because one of the privileges of Parliament was protection from arrest for debt, but we don't know. And he also remained an active member of the British institution. It is tempting to speculate that his membership in the institution became even more important to him after the loss of his collection. A potentially galling event occurred in 1822, the publication of a catalog of Philip Miles's collection, which only a few years earlier had been Hart Davis's collection. This publication respectfully noted Hart Davis's role in building the collection, but also publicized its current possession by another. And so I think in this context, continued participation in the British institution helped Hart Davis maintain his identity as a patron of the arts. And as he rebuilt his fortunes, Hart Davis continued to buy contemporary art, albeit on a more modest scale. Edward Hodges Bailey's bust of him was shown at the Royal Academy in 1823. Bailey also hailed from Bristol and had recently been elected a full academician, taking the place created by Benjamin West's death. Today, he is best known for the statue of Admiral Nelson in Trafalgar Square. You all know it. But he was also much in demand as a sculptor of portrait busts, including this likeness of the author Agnes Strickland, which is actually in the collection here. And in addition to commissioning his own bust from Bailey, in the 1820s, Hart Davis also expanded his collection of portraits by Sir Thomas Lawrence. And among the works he owned was a portrait of his daughter, Louisa, who appears alongside her husband in Scarlett Davis's picture. So, in other words, interior of the British institution is much more of a family picture than we previously realized. But how did this come to be? We don't know how artist and patron met, but my best guess is that it was during the institution's annual painting school, which is a misleading term. It was more of what we would now call a study collection for artists, in which they were invited to copy some of the historic artworks that had been lent by the institution's patrons from their own private collections. And there's evidence to suggest that interior of the British institution was actually created at the school in 1829, which would have afforded Davis the kind of close study he needed to make the very specific replicas that he makes in this work. And we also know that Hart Davis purchased artworks from the schools. In 1814, when he was still flush, he reportedly offered to buy all of the products of that year's school and invited each artist to name his or her own price. So you have to imagine walking into the gallery and just saying, "I'll take everything." And apparently the young artists were quick to take advantage of this opportunity, and the keeper of the gallery felt that Hart Davis had been terribly taken advantage of because the students were all asking for ludicrous prices for very slight copies. But nonetheless, this is a story that speaks to his generosity, and it also gives us a sense that he liked to visit the school and buy works from the school. And it seems possible to me that Hart Davis visited the copying school in 1829, saw this image of the gallery in progress, and bespoke it, then requesting the addition of his portrait and portraits of his family members. But until further evidence is uncovered, we don't know at what stage in the process Hart Davis became involved in its creation. What we can say is that in its finished form, interior of the British institution presents Hart Davis's likeness and those of his daughter and son-in-law as integral parts of a visual history of British art. Moreover, the bust of Hart Davis stands out as the only sculpture in the painting, associating this Bristol merchant with a portrait tradition stretching back to the ancient world. Importantly, this picture also elides the loss of Hart Davis's personal fortune and art collection. Instead, it shows him and his relatives as patrons of a collectively sponsored public art gallery. In this, it departs from more traditional images depicting a family and their possessions. In Davis's painting, the gallery acts as a surrogate home. And now that the mystery of the portrait bust has been solved, we can see how the contents of the institution's temporary exhibition stand in for a lost domestic collection. This image suggests that one reason that the British institution was able to flourish for over 60 years was that it provided opportunities for citizens of modest or newly constrained means to participate in the patronage of art. Now, every good mystery deserves a sequel, which is why I'm happy to report that there is still an unsolved mystery about this painting. And that is the girl in green, who you see standing in profile between Louisa and her husband on the left of the picture. We don't know who she is. The couple had no children, so that obvious explanation goes out the window. She may be their niece, who was 11 years old in 1829, but we have yet to find a matching portrait. And knowing Davis's technique, it seems clear that there was a specific model for this young girl, but we don't know who she is. And I think it's possible that I may not be the one to write this particular sequel. So I'm throwing it out to all of you in the audience tonight. Please keep your eyes peeled for the girl in green, and if you find her, let us know. My own sequel takes a different direction. My next project is to write the history of the British institution, and the full story of this innovative exhibition society has yet to be told. Its leaders developed practices that are still used by museums today, including retrospective exhibitions, exclusive private views, donations of artworks as gifts to the nation, and the kind of blockbuster loan show pictured by John Scarlett Davis. This new project is informed in many ways by my work on pictures within pictures. I've learned that often artists did not exactly record the displays they depicted, and John Scarlett Davis is an excellent example of that fact. He had no compunction about rearranging a display as he found it, or about adding additional works if it served his purposes. And for example, we know that Reynolds' self-portrait was not in the institution in 1829, and I suspect the same is true for the bust of Richard Hart Davis. It was never in this space in that year, but he's put it there for the purposes of his program. And it's also the case that Scarlett Davis is unreliable on issues of decor. And last fall, we were able to see this in person during the splendid exhibition, Spreading Canvas, 18th Century British Marine Paintings, which brought another important work by John Scarlett Davis to the center. And the painting you see here is from the collection of the Walters, and it depicts the Naval Gallery at Greenwich Hospital. And while it was here, we had the wonderful opportunity to compare these two gallery paintings by John Scarlett Davis, and my eye was caught by something really strange, something they have in common. I wonder if you see it. Notice the floor. Notice the repeating rectangular pattern, and I had never seen this or thought about it until the two works were here together. And it seemed very peculiar to me because looking at other images of the British institution, they all show floorboards. None of them show this kind of treatment of the floor. And then, so after running from the second floor to the fourth floor to compare the two paintings, I then ran to the library and pulled out a book on John Scarlett Davis and realized that indeed, in his images of the Louvre and of the Uffizi as well, here it shows up again, this rectangular pattern, and I think it's really clear that this is not a reflection of an actual architectural feature of all these different galleries in France and in Florence and in London, but rather this was an artistic practice, that he liked this pattern because of the way that it emphasized perspective. And it gives us a sense of just how fast and loose Davis was willing to play to get the kind of pictorial effect he wanted. And how tricky it is then to then look back at these images when we're trying to create reconstructions of this kind of space. But although these are not exact records, they still have a lot to tell us about how 19th century viewers consumed art. These pictures present elaborate visual narratives whose representations of individual works of art are meant to be read in concert. In other words, juxtaposition produces meaning. Something similar took place in 19th century exhibitions. To today's viewer, images of salon-style hangs can look crowded and disorderly, but as you will see if you go upstairs to the splendid reinstallation of the Long Gallery here at the center, salon-style hangs can create very rich visual and conceptual experiences. And the dense hangs of the 19th century had many possible readings. Sometimes these readings were intended by exhibition organizers, but at other times they were generated by viewers. But if 19th century images are unreliable witnesses, how are we to study the contents of these displays? The answer, I argue, lies in the same combination of tools that enabled me to identify the portrait bust, that is, old school art historical knowledge and new school digital techniques. And this is the project that Martina alluded to earlier, and recently I had the wonderful experience of working with this new online journal, British Art Studies, which is a joint project of the Yale Center for British Art and the Paul Mellon Center. And working together with the editors and their fantastic team there, we actually reconstructed part of an exhibition that took place at the British Institution in 1823, that is 6 years before John Scarlett Davis made his painting. And the display in that year presented works by Reynolds alongside those of the Continental Old Masters. And this reconstruction was made possible by two things. First of all, the existence of that most traditional art historical resource, the Catalogue Raisonné, truly could not have been done without that. And then second, and just as important, the existence of an online journal whose editors supported the creation of new kinds of digital art history. And this article and the accompanying video seek to start a conversation about best practices for recreating ephemeral displays. The reconstruction was designed to provide transparency about the many decisions and speculations involved. And to that end, the video explores available period images of the institution, including Davis's painting, stressing their role as representations in their own right, and explaining how they informed the digital recreation that follows. The exhibition of 1823 consisted of 2 rooms of old masters and 1 room of Reynolds paintings. For the purposes of this exercise, we focused on the Reynolds room, considering the various possible arrangements of a single surface, the north wall. And that is the wall that is just visible at the end of the space in the Davis painting. And as you can see, this was the wall that was straight ahead of visitors as they entered through the staircase in the central room. And visitors were actually encouraged to start their tour of the galleries here because it's where the catalog numbers started. And it was frequently the site of a major visual programmatic statement. The works present on the wall in 1823 were identified with the help of the exhibition catalog and the Catalogue Raisonné, and sourcing images of these objects raised important methodological questions discussed in the article. So too did the effort to determine how the works were arranged. To reconstruct the north wall, we looked to period hanging conventions. 19th century exhibitions frequently featured what Giles Waterfield described as the decorative style. And this is a style that brings order to a crowded hang through bilateral symmetry, as seen here. And we know that at the Royal Academy, where they used this style, the method of proceeding had a certain logic to it. You need to hang the biggest works first because you don't want to get to the end of your hang and have one massive 6-footer that you can't fit in. So they would put the biggest works up first and then build these symmetrical patterns, choosing side-by-side temporary pendants that you took paintings that were not meant to be together but were of similar size and shape and created these patterns with them. And here I'm actually going to show you a little bit of the video so you can get a sense of what we've done. If I can have a cursor. Suspense builds.
There's a cursor on the screen behind you.
But I can't, well, all right, let's see. Hey, presto, there it is. So as you can see, the largest work hanging on the north wall was the monumental equestrian portrait of George IV, and in a nod to social hierarchy, that painting is actually listed first in the exhibition catalog. So given the hanging practices at the time, we knew that had to be the central work. But once you get there, it gets a little bit dicier. It actually is not straightforward to go from number order to order on a wall. And so what you're going to see here in the video are actually 3 different potential reconstructions of the hang, all roughly following the number order and all basically in accord with period hanging conventions. But we thought it was really important not to choose among them, but actually to give you, the viewers and the user, a chance to see the kind of interpretive work and sometimes the speculation and guesswork that actually goes into creating this kind of reconstruction. And one thing that I found really exciting about this exercise is that you can begin to see that among the various options, even though we don't know the precise arrangement, there are still things in common that become clear, particularly this issue of temporary pendants, two works of similar size and shape that are put together for the purposes of the exhibition and asked to speak to one another along that bilateral symmetry. And those, interestingly, remain constant no matter how you kind of arrange the wall, keeping in mind the hanging order. And so because of that, even though we can't say definitively this is precisely the hang in 1823, this speculative reconstruction still allows us to look closely at the wall and, in fact, read it in the same way that I have previously read pictures like John Scarlett Davis's picture. And like that painting, this installation has many possible interpretations of both national and personal significance. First and foremost, this display was intended by the administrators of the institution to promote Reynolds's reputation. It posed an answer to the seemingly age-old question, is British art worthy of inclusion in the European canon? And it did that in part by juxtaposing Reynolds with old masters. And the catalog to this exhibition answered in the affirmative, declaring, quote, "We rank him among the most eminent painters the art has produced," end quote. The preface also stressed Reynolds' ability to depict both, quote, "gentler feelings and the strongest passions," end quote. In their range and variety, the artworks on this wall provide eloquent visual affirmation of these statements. Multiple genres are represented here, including landscape, genre, and portraiture. Also on view is the development of Reynolds' career over time. The work spanned over 20 years, emphasizing the longevity and the development of his practice. And matching this range in genre and in time period is the social diversity of the subjects. We see here everyone from the king to working class children, a demonstration of Reynolds' versatility. But that is not the only potential reading of this wall. At its heart is the image of a controversial figure, George IV. Reynolds' likeness of George, when Prince of Wales, had made its public debut nearly 40 years earlier at the Royal Academy in 1784. In the interim, the man shown as a dashing young prince had deepened his reputation for debauchery and served a long regency for his ailing father. When he finally became king in 1820, he promptly squandered any goodwill he might have had by seeking to divorce his wife, who became a heroine of the opposition. So the official reading of this installation is patriotic and celebratory. The king presides at the center, surrounded by representations of his subjects. The prominent placement of his image reflects both his social rank and his role as a patron of the institution, where he served in the honorary role as president and also lent generously to the exhibitions. And among the works he lent in 1823 was this painting, attributed at the time to Rubens and titled Philip IV of Spain on Horseback. And this portrait hung on the east side of the middle room, basically on this side of the central gallery, such that if you were standing in the archway, you could actually glance from Rubens' equestrian portrait to Reynolds' equestrian portrait of a monarch. And certainly iconography linked these two images of royalty, and also they were linked in the catalog, where it announced in all caps, just so you wouldn't miss it, that the Rubens was lent by His Majesty. So it was good press at a time when he was badly in need of some good press. And certainly this juxtaposition of Reynolds and Rubens posited the monarch as part of this grand tradition of royal patronage. At the same time, however, it also asserted a place for Reynolds in the grand tradition of artists like Rubens who painted for kings. Nonetheless, other, less celebratory narratives might also be generated from this display. George IV was a divisive figure. Distaste for the king was voiced publicly by radicals such as Charles Lamb and privately by women such as Harriet Arbuthnot, who recorded in her diary with disgust that George spent his coronation celebration making eyes at his current mistress. Such statements put this hang in a different light. As Mark Hallett has shown, at the Royal Academy in the 1780s, viewers generated narratives among the assembled works. In one instance, a critic imagined that an image of the Prince of Wales was ogling a nearby portrait of a courtesan. Some 40 years later, this rake had decidedly not reformed. And I think it was likely that there was an occasion here for similar types of comments and readings. And I think perhaps the hang protests too much. As you will note, in all three reconstructions presented here, George turns his head resolutely away from three portraits of beautiful women. Instead, his gaze falls on the clergyman, and his horse's rear end is pointed towards the ladies. And I don't mean to suggest that the patrons of the British institution intended this reading, but one of the exciting and magical things about exhibitions, frustrating sometimes too, is that once you mount them, they take on a life of their own and that people can interpret them as they will. And certainly there were a number of people in the 1820s who were all too ready to think badly of George IV and to find an occasion to cast aspersions on his name and his predilections. This installation could also, at the same time, have had other, more personal meanings for some of the viewers. And this is the case with one of the beauties that the king seems to ignore, a luscious portrait of a woman in Orientalist pose and dress, painted around 1775. The subject, Mary Horneck, was the daughter of an army officer and a friend of the author Oliver Goldsmith. And legend holds that Reynolds was so moved by her attractions that he proposed to her during a sitting. If he did, that would have been very out of character for him. But it's a good story, and in any case, she did not marry an artist, but a courtier, and actually later served as woman of the bedchamber to Queen Charlotte. On one level, in the hang of 1823, this portrait served to demonstrate Reynolds's artistry and also his versatility. And you'll note that the temporary pendant with which it is paired is this portrait of an Anglican clergyman. And these two very disparate subjects in terms of gender and age and type of costume are, I think, not accidentally linked by this lovely formal rhyme between his billowing white vestments and this creamy Orientalist costume that she's wearing. But the display of Mary Horneck's image might also have suggested another, more mournful contrast between the moment invoked by the portrait and the realities of the present day. The exhibitions of Reynolds's works at the institution marked the passage of time, and most of the people pictured in the assembled portraits in 1823 were long gone. In the years between 1775 and 1823, Mary had been married and then widowed. Her portrait had remained for many years in Reynolds's studio and had been left to her in the artist's will. She then lent it to the institution in 1823. As a lender, she would have been entitled to free entry to the galleries and also coveted tickets to the exclusive evening private views. But we don't know if she went to see this likeness of her younger self, surrounded by images of contemporaries who were already gone. We do know that she spent time in London and kept up her friendships with artists such as James Northcote. According to William Hazlitt, Northcote remarked, quote, "I don't know why she is so kind to come, except that I am the last link in the chain that connects her with all those she most esteemed when she was young, Johnson, Reynolds, and Goldsmith," end quote. Hazlitt reportedly replied, with a touch of misogyny, I think, "Not only so, but you remember what she was at 20. You thus bring back to her the triumphs of her youth," end quote. The institution exhibition must have performed some of the same functions. Here, too, it was possible to remember what Mary Horneck had been like at 20, or at least what Reynolds had imagined her to be in that moment. For many viewers who had known Reynolds personally, including the exhibition organizers, this display marked the passing of a generation. At the same time, however, it was also intended to secure the artist's enduring memory by asserting his place in the international pantheon of art. And of all the possible readings of this installation, it is that we know through documentation was understood by the institution's audience. And journalists and critics in particular were quick to hail this display as evidence of the national prowess in art. Quote, "This exhibition furnished to an Englishman abundant matter for pride and exultation. The power and the grasp of the mind of Reynolds are here seen and felt, seen too in the most dangerous juxtaposition with works that have stood the test of centuries." As these words suggest, many 19th century observers saw the relationship between national traditions as a contest akin to war. The institution was founded with the express mission of helping contemporary British artists surpass their French counterparts, and definitely in the context of the military conflict with France. And this elision of the political and the art historical survives today, not least in the notion that a century's worth of art needs a capital, and that capital must be Paris. But another, less confrontational approach can be seen in the British institution administrators' attitude towards the art of the past. As John Scarlett Davis's picture attests, they sought to expand the canon. The patrons who ran the institution did not think any less of Rubens, even as they displayed works by Reynolds besides his. Rather, theirs was a vision of art history that had room for both. I suggest that we should adopt that same generosity of spirit and imagine a 19th century that has many capitals and many artists worthy of study, including, dare I say it, British artists. Thank you.
That was really fascinating. Thank you so much, Kate. We have a little bit of time for questions, and there's a mic. We must get that bust for the collection, by the way. I remember
Yes.
we talked about that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. And I was wondering if you might take a moment to talk about two additional elements in this painting. The green billowing cloth in the upper right, and the way that the portraits within the portrait of the people living in the three-dimensional space as a fragmented from a studio portrait, that cloth seems to belong to that space too. And then secondly, about frames, it's really interesting how the architecture has been situated, and you spoke of the floors. And the other device that navigates between our space and the spaces within are the physical frames of this painting and how it relates to the frames within the frames. So pictures within pictures, frames within frames.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for those questions. To start with this wonderful drapery swag, it's an interesting moment, and I think it's another moment that cues you to look at Davis's picture not as a kind of intensive document, but as rather a flight of fancy and of artistic expression. And it's clearly, in many ways, he's looking back to Netherlandish precedents and Teniers, and there's a long tradition of this kind of gallery picture in which that kind of drapery, also in portraiture, sort of signaling a fantasy space. And so I think it's a cue both to connect him to the tradition and for us to realize what kind of a space he's showing to us. And then in terms of frames, yes, absolutely. And that play on the painted frame and the three-dimensional physical frame is very powerful. And actually, if you go upstairs in the Long Gallery and take a look at a picture by Benjamin West, a portrait of a man named Eardley Wilmot, you'll see there's a really great kind of play on that sort of moment and making you realize the nature of representation. And that makes me want to mention that you may recognize the frames in the reconstruction. These are all frames from the Yale Center for British Art that were conveniently available for this project. But as you'll see, we actually, in each of the options, I don't know if you noticed, but the frames actually swap around. And that's to indicate the fact that this is another moment in the reconstruction where we lack precise information. And so we're trying to signal that there are a lot of variables, including what kind of frames were these actually in.
Were the frames ever described in the catalogs of the exhibitions?
No, and we're actually lucky sometimes in the institution we get dimensions, which helps with tracking a work, but it just wasn't the kind of information they would tell us.
Thank you very much. I'm really fascinated by the Reynolds painting of George IV. And it reminds me, I think John knows this story really well, and perhaps you do already too, but of Trumbull's Revenge, the story of Trumbull's Revenge. Very quickly, it is, a painting by John Trumbull of George Washington. It recreates this, or it actually came before this painting. I don't know, actually. It's about 1793 or so when Trumbull painted it. Anyway, it was the second painting of George Washington that Trumbull made for the city of Charleston and presented it to them. They rejected the first painting, and so Trumbull made a second painting and turned the horse around in just the way that Reynolds depicts here. And that painting acquired the nickname Trumbull's Revenge. And it just made me wonder about this motif in paintings, and whether this is something that would have been, funny and sort of, I don't know, was it popular, or how did people respond to that when they saw it in this exhibition?
Thank you so much for letting me know about that. I wasn't aware of that story, and I'm so glad you've given me fodder for my reading of this as sort of, it's not his revenge, but it might be his renunciation. And certainly he wasn't renunciating in his personal life, but they could achieve it in the gallery. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate. It's always wonderful to hear where you're going with this research, and I'm especially interested in what you're doing with the British institution, which you've breathed life into in so many interesting ways. Can we go back to the Scarlett Davis, the BI picture? Yeah. So, what was the British institution teaching its visitors? Because you go to the Louvre, and the entire history of art is a procession from antiquity leading up to France, basically, in some ways. The climax of the display is modern French art, and it's a linear progression, and it's quite clearly that. But was this arranged in historical linear fashion, or was it actually, as it were, a kind of a lesson in connoisseurship and quality, which was not organized by school and by chronology, and therefore didn't necessarily have to have a climax in the present? Or how are you reading that?
Well, actually, I'd like to look at, thinking about this space and what it means in answering to your question, to have Reynolds in the North Room, which was the best room. The light was best in there, which is why artists would be quite cross in the sale exhibitions if they were put in the other rooms. And so they've given Reynolds a real primacy, but it's not in the same sort of developmental force march through history kind of thing that you see at the Louvre or other places. It is the persistence of a different kind of viewing, which is really, I think, about savoring juxtaposition and being able to have a Rubens and a Reynolds in the same space quite easily so that you can compare and contrast them. And interestingly, it actually started out more segregated by national school. And then as I think they gain more confidence in this project of advocating for British art by showing it with the old masters, it's sort of as if, in 1823, they're not sure if they really put them side by side, is Reynolds going to suffer? And then by the end of the 1820s, they're actually juxtaposing, Titian and Reynolds and Gainsborough and Teniers all in the same room. So it actually becomes more heterogeneous and more about giving that opportunity to do side-by-side comparisons. So I think in some ways what they're teaching is connoisseurship, but also nationalism, and this idea that British art really can hold its own in this space.
So a lot of your talk focused on the relationship between institution, artist, and patron, but you also show images in which large crowds of the public are consuming art. And so I'm wondering what these images of paintings within paintings can teach us about public habits of art consumption at the time, and what the relationship between the crowd and these images can suggest.
That's a great question. And one of the things that is important in this moment is to realize that there's very little we can learn about actual crowd behavior from these paintings. because especially with the Davis, it's a very idealized vision of how the space would be used. And it's one thing we actually struggled with in the reconstruction. As you can see, it's empty. It's missing actually the vital animating part, which is the audience. So I think it can tell us about expectations. It can tell us about what artists and patrons hoped for their spaces as opposed to how they were actually used. And I think also it can tell us the kind of reading that was expected in these spaces. And I think that's what's interesting about the Davis. For example, I don't know if they had chairs. I don't know if women like Louisa Davis, the woman in the white dress, got to sit down in the gallery. We don't have the documentation that I've found yet. So it can't speak to that kind of use, which is actually important when you're thinking about women in corsets and heavy dresses, and that's actually an interesting logistical question. Does she have a privileged seat where she can actually sit down and look at a picture? So we can't speak to that, and yet the method that Davis has of building this very complicated program makes me think that there was an expectation that at least some viewers would really engage with the work in a way where they were, and with the exhibition in a way where they were doing comparisons and contrasts and thinking about different works in relation to each other. And also, sometimes it doesn't have to be about art history, right? Sometimes it's about a joke about the prince and what he likes.
Thank you, Kate. That's a really wonderful tour. I can't wait to read your book. I was wondering whether the date of the John Scarlett Davis painting, which is 29, is it? Whether you think that's a significance in terms of the art market. And you've already talked about the various financial crashes that were happening in the teens, but there was a really spectacular one in 29, wasn't there? And whether that was had happened by the time he made the painting, I don't know, but whether you could read that as some sort of, commentary on that scenario, because it's a disaster for artists. I mean, even Turner doesn't sell anything in 1829.
That's a really good question.
I also thought it looks a bit like Christie's South Kensington, but that's that's sort of, probably coincidental. But,
that's a great question. I know that for Davis, this, selling pictures like this was a matter of great concern. And actually, the image of the Naval Gallery that I showed from the Walters, that was bought by Charles Long, who was a major prime mover behind the British institution. And Davis went to him and said, if you don't buy this picture, I'm going to have to put it in the hands of a dealer and just take whatever I can for it. And then Long wrote him a check for 100 guineas. And that was a really big deal for Davis. So personally, the marketability of this kind of image was very important. And there was, there were a number of kind of dips and uncertainty in the markets. 26 was also a very bad year financially. And one of the things that's interesting is that in that moment, the institution we're seeing here, this is the loan show of historic art, but every year there were two shows, the loan show and the sale show, and where this was shown, indeed, at that sale exhibition, and that was a really important market for artists. And interestingly, the number, we have some records of the sales there, specific works that were sold and people who had bought them, and it seems to have stayed pretty buoyant despite, the numbers don't crash as much as you think they would in 26.